The morning sun poured through the windows of the grand hotel ballroom, casting soft golden light across the polished marble floors. It was the day of the wedding, the day everyone had been waiting for. Family and friends had gathered, dressed in their finest attire, their hearts full of excitement for the ceremony. The bride, radiant in her white gown, floated from room to room, checking with the wedding planners, ensuring everything was perfect. But amid the buzz of preparations and the joy of the occasion, there was an undercurrent of tension that no one could quite put their finger on. For the groom's black grandmother, the day was both a celebration and a test. She had arrived early, dressed in her finest attire, her silver hair carefully styled, and her pearls gleaming against the soft fabric of her dress. Her presence in the room was dignified, but there was an undeniable feeling of isolation. As the only member of the groom's side of the family who had traveled far to attend, she had hoped for a warm welcome from the bride's family. Instead, she felt the cold whispers and sideways glances that came from behind her back. The bride's family, though well-meaning in their own way, seemed to have made their own assumptions about the groom's side of the family. The groom's grandmother wasn't just a grandmother. She was a woman of great strength and pride. And in her eyes, family meant respect, honor, and love. But on this particular day, respect felt like it was in short supply. As the guests mingled and the ceremony preparations continued, the grandmother found herself standing near the balcony, watching the bride's family and friends chat and laugh together. The bride's mother, a woman who was known for her perfectionist tendencies, was busy making sure everything was flawless. The groom's grandmother couldn't help but notice the whispers. Some of the younger women in the bridal party giggled as they stole glances in her direction. She felt their eyes on her, judging her, and though she tried to brush it off, the hurt lingered. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the bridesmaids, a young woman who seemed far too cheerful, approached her with a glass of champagne. She smiled sweetly, but there was a coldness behind her eyes that made the grandmother uneasy. "Would you like some champagne, grandmother?" the bridesmaid asked, holding out the glass as if it were a formality. The grandmother took the glass, nodding politely, but she could sense the subtle mockery in the girl's tone. The smile on the bridesmaid's face didn't reach her eyes, and for a moment, the grandmother could almost feel the judgment being passed. She wasn't welcome here, not as a grandmother, not as a woman of her background, and certainly not as someone who didn't fit the idealized image of perfection the bride's family seemed to hold so dear. She took a sip of the champagne, her fingers tightening around the stem of the glass as she fought the urge to lash out. She had seen this type of behavior before, the quiet, underhanded racism disguised as polite smiles and forced pleasantries. She knew exactly what they were thinking, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. As the ceremony drew closer, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The groom, who had been busy with last-minute preparations, walked in just as the tension reached its peak. He could feel it in the air, the discomfort, the sense of something amiss. His eyes immediately sought out his grandmother. She was standing alone near the balcony, her posture as strong and graceful as always, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made his heart ache. He wanted to go to her, to wrap his arms around her and tell her everything would be okay. But he knew better. He knew the family he had married into, knew how they could be. And he also knew that his grandmother, though hurt, would never let them see the full extent of her pain. She was a pillar of strength, a woman who had lived through the toughest of times and still stood tall. The groom made his way over to her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that no matter how much he loved her, he couldn't always protect her from the hurt she would face in a world that still wasn't always kind. As he reached her, he offered her a smile, one that he hoped would reassure her, though he knew deep down that it couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. "Are you okay, grandmother?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. She turned to him, her smile warm but her eyes betraying the pain she felt. "I'm fine, my dear," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of sorrow behind her words. "I'm just fine." But as the ceremony began, The unease only deepened. The bride's family had no idea how deep their disrespect had gone. They believed they were just being playful, that their comments and glances were harmless. But to the grandmother, they cut deep, reminding her of all the times in her life when people had looked down on her simply because of who she was. As the guests took their seats, the groom's grandmother stood up straight, as if preparing for battle. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a moment of reckoning, and she knew it. The bride's family had made their assumptions, but the grandmother was about to show them something they never expected. What they didn't realize was that their actions had set something in motion, something that would change the course of the day. And when the unexpected happened, they would finally understand the true meaning of respect. But for now, all they could do was smile and pretend that everything was fine, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. As the wedding ceremony continued, the tension in the air thickened. The guests had taken their seats, the music played softly in the background, and the bride and groom exchanged their vows. But the atmosphere was far from lighthearted. There was an undercurrent of discomfort that no one seemed to want to acknowledge, but it was undeniable. The bride's family, already on edge, continued to cast glances toward the groom's side, especially towards his black grandmother, who stood elegantly, maintaining her dignity despite the whispers. She could feel the weight of their stares, their judgments. The bride's family had never expected her to be part of the day, not truly. They had assumed her presence was merely a formality, someone who would be quiet and unobtrusive, content to stay in the background. But they had underestimated her. The grandmother stood beside her grandson, the groom, who was trying his best to stay composed. He noticed how his family seemed to be invisible to the bride's family, as if they didn't even belong in the same room. He could see the subtle snickers among the bridesmaids, hear the laughter, and feel the uncomfortable glances being thrown his way. It was clear to him that the bride's family was not happy with the marriage, and perhaps they were even unhappy with the idea of his grandmother attending the wedding at all. His heart sank, but he refused to show his emotions. He had always been taught to keep his head high and not let others' actions dictate his behavior. However, this time, it was different. He could see the hurt in his grandmother's eyes, and it was a feeling he could not ignore. As the wedding reception began, the tension was palpable. The guests slowly made their way to the reception hall, chatting and laughing, but the energy felt forced. The bride's family continued to make small talk, pretending to be interested in the events unfolding around them, but their attention kept drifting back to the groom's grandmother. It was as if her presence, her very existence, was a disruption to their perfect picture of the wedding. The grandmother, sensing the subtle hostility, refused to back down. She was not a woman to be pushed aside or disregarded. She had lived through more than they could imagine, and had earned her place at this celebration, just as much as anyone else. Yet the looks and comments she received suggested otherwise. The bride's mother, who had been managing the wedding with precision, came over to the grandmother, attempting to make small talk. Her smile was tight, her words polite but distant. She didn't know how to act around this woman who was so different from everyone she knew. "It's such a beautiful day, isn't it?" the bride's mother said, forcing a smile as she gestured toward the ballroom filled with people. The grandmother, however, saw through the polite facade. She knew that the woman didn't truly want to engage with her. She had experienced this before, people who pretended to be kind while secretly looking down on her. Despite the woman's attempts to make her feel comfortable, the grandmother remained calm and composed. "It is a lovely day," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. A day of celebration. But as the conversation went on, the undertone of disrespect became more apparent. The bride's mother, not knowing how to proceed, awkwardly shifted the conversation. She made a comment about the wedding preparations and how everything had to be perfect, as if to justify the constant scrutiny of the groom's side of the family. The bride's grandmother could sense the woman's discomfort and realized that the tension was growing between them. It was no longer just about the wedding. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. In the corner of the room, the younger bridesmaids continued their whispering, their eyes flickering between the bride's family and the groom's grandmother. One of them, who had been particularly vocal earlier, dared to speak up. She made a remark, loud enough for the grandmother to hear, but wrapped in a thin veil of politeness. "It must be so nice to be here for such an important event," she said, with a chuckle that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure you've seen many weddings in your time." The grandmother turned towards her, her expression calm but firm. "Yes, I've seen my fair share," she replied, her tone polite yet carrying a weight of experience that could not be ignored. "But this one is different. It's a celebration of love, and love has no color, no boundaries." For a brief moment, there was silence. The young bridesmaid, caught off guard, looked down, unable to respond. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. But the tension was broken quickly as the bride, unaware of the growing tension, stepped forward with a bright smile and joined the conversation. "Oh, Grandma, I'm so happy you could be here," she said, giving her a hug. The bride's words were sincere, but the grandmother couldn't shake the feeling that they were simply an attempt to smooth over the awkwardness created by her family. The grandmother returned the hug, but her eyes searched the room, noting the subtle discomfort in the faces of the bride's family. They were pretending, putting on an act to make the day seem perfect. But deep down, they were angry that someone like her had a place in this sacred moment. She knew she couldn't change their minds, but she could make them see her strength, her dignity, and the love she had for her grandson. As the reception continued, the strains of polite conversation and fake smiles wore on, and the grandmother made a silent promise to herself. She would not be silenced. She would not be moved. She had earned her place here, and no amount of discomfort from the bride's family could take that away from her. The night was far from over, and though the encounter had been tense, it was only the beginning of the drama that was about to unfold. The evening had settled into its usual rhythm, with laughter and soft music filling the air, as the guests mingled over drinks and hors d'oeuvres. Yet the tension that had marked the earlier parts of the evening had not entirely dissipated. The groom's grandmother, who had tried her best to keep her composure despite the subtle mockery from the bride's family, felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had been through much in her life, but this moment, this feeling of being out of place, was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. The bride's family continued to behave as though everything was fine, but the underlying disrespect toward the groom's family remained clear. The whispers, the stares, and the dismissive glances, they hadn't stopped. The grandmother, however, had made her peace with it. She had decided that her presence at the wedding was not only for her grandson, but also to show that she, too, deserved respect. She had endured much in her life and had earned her place here, whether anyone liked it or not. As the night wore on, the first dance began. The bride and groom took to the floor, spinning around in perfect harmony, their eyes locked on each other. The guests cheered and clapped, but the grandmother stood at the edge of the room, watching with quiet pride. She was happy for her grandson, of course, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in this celebration. She had always believed that weddings were a time for families to come together, but tonight, it seemed as though the walls between her family and the bride's were growing ever higher. It was then that the unexpected happened. The young bridesmaid who had been mocking her earlier, the one who had made the comment about the grandmother attending so many weddings, stepped forward from the crowd. She had been laughing with a group of her friends, but as the grandmother stood watching the dance, the bridesmaid seemed to sense an opportunity. She was emboldened by the alcohol she had consumed and the apparent safety of the moment. As the bride and groom continued their dance, the bridesmaid approached the grandmother, her expression dripping with fake sweetness. "You know," the bridesmaid began, her voice loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "you must be so proud to see your grandson marrying someone so different from you." The grandmother turned slowly to face her, her eyes narrowing. She could feel the blood rushing to her face as she fought to stay calm. The bridesmaid's words were thinly veiled insults, meant to provoke and humiliate her. For a brief moment, the world around the grandmother seemed to blur. The music, the laughter, and the celebration all faded as she took a deep breath. This was not the time to let her emotions control her, but neither could she let this pass. With a voice that rang with authority and quiet dignity, the grandmother responded, "I am proud of my grandson, yes, but I am also proud of the man he has become. He is a man who knows the value of respect, love, and family, things that you clearly have yet to understand." The words hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. The room fell silent, the conversation and music halting as guests turned to watch. The bridesmaid, stunned by the grandmother's calm yet firm reply, faltered for a moment. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she tried to recover by laughing nervously. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it, really," she stammered, her forced laugh echoing awkwardly. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The groom, who had been watching from the other side of the room, could feel his heart racing. He had seen the exchange from afar, and his instincts told him that this was no small moment. He rushed over to his grandmother's side, placing a protective hand on her arm. His eyes were full of concern, but there was also a fire in them, an anger he had been holding back all evening. He had seen the disrespect his grandmother had endured, and now he couldn't stand by any longer. He turned to the bridesmaid, his voice steady but full of authority. "You need to apologize to my grandmother." "Now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bridesmaid, now realizing the gravity of the situation, stammered a half-hearted apology, but the damage was done. The guests around them were no longer smiling, no longer whispering in hushed tones. They were watching, some in shock, others in disbelief. This wasn't the perfect wedding they had envisioned. This wasn't the flawless evening they had expected. The groom's grandmother, a woman who had been disrespected and mocked, had just turned the tables on them with a grace and strength they could never have anticipated. As the bridesmaid awkwardly stepped back into the crowd, the room remained in stunned silence. The groom's grandmother didn't need to say another word. Her presence, her calm demeanor, and her unwavering dignity had spoken louder than any words ever could. The bride, who had been blissfully unaware of the disrespect her family had been showing, stepped forward at that moment, her face full of realization. "I am so sorry," the bride said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I had no idea." The grandmother, her face softening, gave a small nod. "It's all right, my dear," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "You didn't know, but now you do." And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. The room, still heavy with the tension of the moment, began to relax. People slowly started to talk again, but this time, it wasn't about the groom's grandmother or the bride's family. It was about something deeper. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and though the shock had left many feeling uncomfortable, it had also brought about a much-needed change. The bride's family, for all their wealth and privilege, had been reminded of something far more important than money or status: respect, humility, and the value of love. The grandmother, standing tall and proud, had shown them all that no one could take away her place in her grandson's life. She would not be dismissed or belittled. She was there to stay, and her presence had just changed the course of the evening forever. The night had shifted in an instant. What had started as a day of celebration, filled with joy and excitement, was now defined by the powerful words and actions of the groom's grandmother. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had changed the course of the evening. The guests, who had been caught up in the tension, were now forced to acknowledge the weight of the moment. The bride's family, who had once made cruel assumptions about the groom's side, were left to confront their own ignorance and misjudgments. The bride, her face flushed with the realization of what had transpired, took a deep breath as she approached her grandmother-in-law. She could no longer ignore the quiet storm that had been brewing all evening, and now, standing face to face with the woman who had been so disrespected, she felt the full weight of her own family's behavior. I'm so sorry," the bride began, her voice filled with emotion. "I had no idea this was happening. I didn't know how they were treating you. Please forgive me." The grandmother, standing tall and composed, looked at her with calm eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, only understanding. "It's not you, my dear," she said softly. "You didn't know. And that's what matters. You've learned today, and that is what counts." Her voice was filled with wisdom, each word carrying the strength of a lifetime of experiences. The groom stood behind his grandmother, his arm around her shoulders in support. He was proud of her, proud of the way she had handled the disrespect without losing her dignity. He had known she was strong, but tonight, she had shown everyone just how powerful her resolve truly was. He turned to the bride, his eyes filled with sincerity. "Thank you for understanding, for standing up and acknowledging the truth. That means more to us than anything," he said. "This wedding is not just about two people coming together, but about the coming together of two families. Respect and love must be the foundation." The bride nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She knew her family had acted inappropriately, and now she had to make things right. She turned to her family, who had been standing nearby, watching the exchange unfold. The tension in the room had started to lift, but the reality of what had happened still lingered in the air. With a deep breath, the bride walked toward her mother and the other members of her family who had been involved in the earlier remarks. Her voice was steady, but there was a clear sense of resolve in her words. "Mom, I need you to apologize to Grandma," the bride said firmly. "This behavior is unacceptable. You may not realize the damage you've done, but you've hurt someone who should have been treated with nothing but respect. It's time for us to take responsibility for that." The bride's mother, her face red with embarrassment, glanced at the grandmother, who was still standing nearby, watching with quiet dignity. It was clear that the weight of the situation had hit her hard. She had not realized how deeply her words had cut, how the hurt her daughter's family had caused could never be undone with a simple apology. But there was no turning back now. "I'm sorry," the bride's mother said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't understand. I've always wanted everything to be perfect, but in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters. Please forgive me." The grandmother nodded, her eyes softening. "I understand," she said, her voice filled with compassion. "We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them that matters. I've forgiven you, and now we can move forward." The tension in the room finally began to dissipate. Guests, who had been standing awkwardly, began to exchange glances, and a sense of unity seemed to fill the space. What had begun as a moment of discord was now turning into a moment of healing, of understanding. The bride's family, once so caught up in their own perceptions of superiority, were now being shown what true strength and dignity looked like. The grandmother, though deeply hurt by the disrespect she had endured, had chosen not to hold on to the pain. She had confronted it head-on, refusing to let it define her or the moment. Her strength had inspired the groom, the bride, and everyone present. They had seen firsthand the power of grace and forgiveness, and they understood that the true essence of a family was not found in perfection, but in the ability to grow and learn together. As the night drew to a close, the bride and groom stood together, holding hands, their hearts full of love and newfound respect for each other and their families. The bride's family had come to understand that the value of a person is not measured by their appearance or status, but by their character and the respect they show others. The groom's grandmother, with her quiet dignity, had reminded them all of this. She had shown them that respect is not something that can be demanded, but something that must be earned through actions, not words. It was a powerful lesson that would not soon be forgotten. As the final moments of the evening passed, the guests slowly began to leave, each one carrying with them the memory of the grandmother's strength and the impact of her words. The bride and groom, united in love and surrounded by a newfound sense of respect, knew that this wedding would be remembered not just for the beautiful ceremony, but for the powerful resolution that had changed the course of their lives forever. It was a night of healing, a night of understanding, and a night where true love and respect had triumphed over all.